The fluorescent lights hummed against the antiseptic smell of Cedar Creek Medical at 2,247 hours. Megan O'Brien refilled the medication cart on the night shift, her hands moving with a kind of precision that rendered her invisible to everyone around her. 8 months. That's how long she'd been here, pushing the cart down corridors that felt like purgatory, wearing scrubs instead of body armor, keeping the folded flag with Rodriguez's name in her locker instead of her chest. She didn't tremble. She didn't let anyone see the weight of it. The slight limp when she walked, old shrapnel, she'd told the intake nurse once, was from an IED blast outside Fallujah that she'd never mentioned. Her scrubs were perfectly pressed. Her competence was seamless. Invisible. That was the assignment. Captain Megan O'Brien, Navy Medical Corps, discharged into Cedar Creek Medical's night shift 8 months ago as part of a classified Pentagon program tracking wounded operators. No one knew. No one asked. She moved through the hospital like water through a sieve, present but unnoticed, efficient enough to be forgotten by morning. The shift supervisor, Janet, didn't look up when Megan passed the nurse's station. Dr. Pierce had arrived for evening rounds at 1900 hours, his expensive loafers clicking against the tile floor with the sound of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. He dismissed her patient update without making eye contact, already scrolling through his tablet before she'd finished speaking. That was fine. That was preferred. Megan had learned in Baghdad that the quietest person in a room was often the most dangerous, and she intended to stay quiet. She'd completed her pharmacy calculations faster than the software could process them, a reflex from field medicine when speed meant the difference between life and hemorrhage, and the resident had blinked twice and said nothing. No questions. No suspicion. Good. She touched the challenge coin in her pocket, the one embedded with shrapnel from the Chinook that had carried Rodriguez out. She'd never removed it. Not in 8 months. The emergency department doors opened at 2,315 hours. The intake nurse called out a name that made something in Megan's spine go rigid. Lieutenant Commander Jackson Hayes. Navy SEAL. Medical retirement. Her hands continued moving, refilling the dopamine cartridge, checking me for setup on the crash cart, but the rest of her had already traveled back to Baghdad, to the mission briefing she'd attended 8 months ago before her sudden discharge, the slot that Hayes had filled, the convoy he'd been on when the IED detonated. The intake form listed the injury: blast trauma, bilateral retinal detachment, permanent vision loss. She'd read the briefing on Hayes before deployment. Force Recon Specialist. Medic. The kind of operator who didn't hesitate. The kind of operator who'd taken her place. And now he was here, in Cedar Creek Medical, in a wheelchair. Megan didn't stop moving. She finished the medication cart. She checked the crash cart. She walked to Hayes's room at 0100 hours with the casualness of someone checking on a routine admission. The curtain was drawn. She could hear him breathing, the slight rattle that suggested a pain management issue. She knocked, not a request, just protocol, and pulled back the curtain. The man in the bed was younger than she'd expected. Blonde. Built like someone who'd spent the last decade doing things that required absolute stillness and absolute violence. His eyes were closed, but not the way sleeping eyes close. These were the eyes of someone who'd learned that opening them didn't matter anymore. "How are you feeling, Lieutenant Commander?" Hayes's head turned toward her voice. His jaw was tight. "Where am I?" "Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh. Night shift. You came in through the ED about 2 hours ago." She kept her voice flat, clinical, the way a nurse sounds when she's being professional. Not the way a captain sounds. Never the way a captain sounds. "Your intake shows you need a surgical consult. Optic nerve reconstruction." 5 doctors looked at my file. His voice was like a radio tuned to a station that didn't quite exist, sharp, aware, angry underneath. 5 said no. Said the risk wasn't worth it. Said I should accept the reality and move on. He turned his head away. "Nobody's going to touch this one." Megan didn't respond. She took his blood pressure. 138/82. Elevated but stable. She checked the fall line, made sure the saline drip was running at the correct rate, 60 milliliters per hour, slow and steady. Routine. Invisible. But her hands weren't trembling. They were cold. The same cold that came before a mission, when you checked your gear for the last time and knew that everything you'd spent 18 months training for was about to matter. Hayes had taken her slot. He'd run the mission she was supposed to run. And now he was here, and 5 doctors had already said no, and she was the only one in this room who understood what it meant to be marked for invisible duty, to be the one no one sees until the moment they have to. "You should rest," she said. "I'll be back in 2 hours to check vitals." She left his room and found the nearest supply closet, stepping inside and closing the door. She didn't cry. She didn't let the trembling start. She pulled out the challenge coin from her pocket, the one with Rodriguez's blood still faintly visible on the edge if you knew where to look, and held it until her hands stopped being cold. 8 months of invisible duty at Cedar Creek. 8 months of touching this coin every shift, of remembering Rodriguez, of remembering the slot that Hayes had filled, the mission that her team had run without her. And now he was here. Blind. Marked for abandonment by 5 of the best surgeons in the hospital. Marked the way anyone marked for death gets marked, with the silent agreement of everyone around them that some lives cost too much to save. When she opened the supply closet door at 0107 hours, her composure was back. Her hands were steady. Her voice was ready. She walked past the nurse's station where Janet was charting something mindlessly, past the residence area where no one was watching, back to Hayes's room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the blind man's face in profile, seeing the ridge of his jawline, the way his hands gripped the bed rail like it was something he could control. "Your surgery," she said quietly. "We'll figure it out." Hayes turned his head toward her voice again. This time, his expression shifted. Slightly. Barely. The way someone shifts when they've heard something they didn't expect to hear. "You can't promise that." "No," Megan said. "I can't. But I'm Captain Megan O'Brien, and I don't abandon people under my command. So we're going to find someone who will." The moment stretched between them. Hayes's face didn't change, but something in the room changed. The sound of the ventilator behind him seemed louder. The fluorescent lights hummed a different frequency. And Megan, standing in the doorway of Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh, holding onto a promise she might not be able to keep, felt the weight of something shifting. The assignment that had been so carefully calibrated, so perfectly invisible, had just acquired a patient. A face. A blind Navy SEAL who'd taken her slot in Baghdad and now needed something no one at this hospital wanted to provide. The next 72 hours would determine whether she could save him. What happened next didn't just test her mission. It destroyed it. She walked back to the medication cart, her limp slightly more pronounced than usual, and made the first phone call. Not to anyone at Cedar Creek. Not to anyone in Raleigh. This was the kind of call that went higher. Much higher. She used the encrypted line she kept in her locker next to Rodriguez's flag, the one that connected directly to a Pentagon extension that officially didn't exist. The woman who answered didn't say hello. She didn't need to. Megan recognized the voice from her debriefing 8 months ago. "Hayes needs a surgical consult. The best one you can find. Optic nerve reconstruction. He doesn't have much time." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then, "Are you compromising the assignment?" "No," Megan said quietly. "I'm completing it." She hung up and returned to Cedar Creek's night shift, invisible again, waiting, knowing that something had just been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0600 hours for morning rounds, his loafers clicking against tile, his tablet ready, his authority unquestioned. He didn't know that a phone call had gone out to the Pentagon. He didn't know that a folded flag sat in a locker 2 floors down, waiting. He didn't know that the quiet night shift nurse he dismissed without looking was a captain, and that captains didn't abandon their people. Not for 5 refusals. Not for anything. The hospital was about to learn that some things cost more than liability insurance, and that sometimes the person you ignore is the one holding everything together. 5 doctors. That's what it took to kill a case before it ever made it to surgery. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium in grand rounds, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to raise it. 5 refusals. 5 different angles on the same verdict. Lieutenant Commander Jackson Hayes was a liability Cedar Creek Medical could not afford. Dr. Valmorn had spoken first about experimental protocols and FDA oversight. Dr. Chen followed with insurance complications. Dr. Okoye detailed the VA system's capacity for this exact patient profile. Dr. Strauss enumerated surgical risk factors, hemorrhage, infection, the compounded danger of operating on someone with existing trauma to the optic nerve. And Dr. Pierce himself had closed with institutional liability exposure, 1 complication, 1 lawsuit, and the hospital's malpractice insurance would skyrocket. The residents took notes. The attendings nodded. The case was closed. Megan sat in the back row, watching Hayes's file being stamped with 5 rejection stamps, watching 5 doctors explain why a man with no other options should simply accept permanent darkness as the cost of service. She stood. The sound of her chair scraping back was small, but in that auditorium full of 180 people, it landed like a gavel strike. Heads turned. Dr. Pierce's eyes lifted from his notes with the slow precision of a predator noticing movement in tall grass. Captain Megan O'Brien, he said, reading her name badge as if translating from a foreign language. Tell me, in your 8 months here, have you developed expertise in experimental neurosurgery? Or are you simply unable to recognize when a case exceeds your scope of practice? The laughter started immediately. Soft at first, then spreading like a contagion through the tiered seating. Residents elbowed each other. An attending in the 3rd row smiled into his coffee. Megan's voice was steady. I volunteer to coordinate his non-surgical care. Specialists, consultations, rehabilitation resources. Everything outside the operating room. How noble, Pierce said, and the word dripped with something that wasn't quite contempt, it was worse. It was dismissal. This patient belongs in VA care, Nurse O'Brien. Not being coddled by someone with a hero complex. That's where people like him go when they need help the world's already decided they don't deserve. He turned back to his presentation. Next case. She sat down. Didn't flinch. Didn't let the silence, that surgical, bleeding silence, register as a wound. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her jaw was exactly where it belonged. Her eye stayed forward, neutral as a checkpoint guard. But someone had heard the nickname crystallize in that moment, Nurse Hero. 2 hours later, the fluorescent lights in the hallway outside the break room buzzed with the particular hum of afternoon shift change. Megan stood at the vending machine, selecting coffee with the deliberation of someone diffusing explosives. The selection dial clicked. The cup dropped. The machine hissed. All small sounds, but loud enough to cover the conversation 3 feet behind her. I'll help him, a resident said, pitching his voice high and thin. I'll save everyone. The other one laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the tile. Does she know what she looks like? Just standing there like she's about to leap off a building. Nurse Hero, the first one said again, and this time the mockery was musical, perfected. They were artists of cruelty, these two. They'd been practicing since medical school. Megan didn't turn around. Her hands remained steady as she pulled the coffee from the dispenser. The warmth of the cup registered against her palms, real, grounding, true. She could feel them watching her the way hunters watch prey that hasn't yet realized it's been marked. Dr. Pierce stood nearby, arms crossed, that thin smile fixed to his face like a surgical scar. He wasn't laughing. He was watching her like a man watching an investment vehicle decline in value. He was watching to see if she would break. She took one measured breath. Then she let a single tear slide down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the weight of things she couldn't explain, couldn't justify, couldn't share. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling in her hands was not fear. It was discipline, held so tightly it had to leak out somewhere. Her eye was the chosen vessel. She maintained eye contact with Pierce's reflection in the vending machine glass. Just long enough. Just until she saw his smile falter for a fraction of a second. Then she wiped the tear away slowly, deliberately, like erasing a minor error. She collected her coffee. She walked past both residents without breaking stride, her uniform crisp, her badge catching the light, her composure moving through that room like a perfectly aimed knife. Behind her, the laughter stopped. Someone cleared their throat. Dr. Pierce's expression had shifted to something colder and less certain. That evening, Megan returned to Hayes's room to find the man waiting for her. Not Hayes, Pierce. Standing near the window with his back to the door, hands in his pockets, looking at the cardiac monitor like it might tell him something valuable. She didn't let the surprise register on her face. Years of training had immunized her against visible tells. She simply entered, began checking the drip, moved like every shift was routine. "I've contacted surgical consults at Duke and UNC," she said quietly, her voice no louder than the ventilator's steady wheeze. It was a test. She needed to know how much he knew, how far he'd already moved. Pierce turned. In the evening light from the window, his face looked different, a sharp, carved from something harder than flesh. "If you contact one more outside facility on behalf of this patient, security will escort you from this building." Do I make myself clear, Nurse Hero? The nickname was a weapon. He'd sharpened it with every mouth that repeated it. Megan set down her equipment. She took one measured breath. The same kind of breath you take before stepping into a firefight, before making a decision that changes everything, before speaking words that cannot be unsaid. Lieutenant Commander Hayes served our country with more honor than you'll ever comprehend. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't exist in hospitals. No monitors beeped. No for pumps chimed. No distant code blue called. The very air seemed to understand that something important had just occurred. Pierce's jaw tightened. A muscle flexed near his temple. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register that suggested he was speaking to himself as much as to her. "We'll see how long that nobility lasts." He left without waiting for a response, and Megan was alone again with Hayes, who had never opened his eyes during any of it, who would never know that a line had just been drawn in the sand, that someone in a hospital without medals or rank or authority had just refused to break. But that wasn't the worst part. The next 3 days moved like a chess match where only one player understood the rules. Pierce didn't yell again. That would have been predictable. Instead, he weaponized the systems, the kind of bureaucratic precision that made it impossible to argue because he was simply following protocol, simply protecting the hospital, simply doing his job. Megan watched it unfold with the clarity of someone trained to read threats the way others read weather patterns. Day 1 started at shift change. The ICU census was 12 patients, and Pierce reassigned 4 of the nursing staff to the medical surgical floor, leaving a 3-person rotation for a unit that required 5. The schedule appeared almost accidental on the posted board, staff reduction due to seasonal budget constraints, nothing to do with Hayes specifically. But Hayes was on continuous monitoring protocol, which meant someone needed eyes on his vitals every 15 minutes. With 4 nurses covering 12 beds, that became someone covering 12 beds and checking monitors in between other patients' medications and wound care and family questions. The gaps would be inevitable. Not criminal. Just inevitable. "It's brilliant," said Torres, the IT specialist who worked nights, pressing a hand against the server room door frame as Megan passed. Torres was a Marine, had been, carried that operational awareness like a scar. Calculated. "You see it?" "I see it," Megan said. "Be careful." Day 2 brought the surgical schedule change. The one doctor who hadn't explicitly refused Hayes, Dr. Chen, a vascular surgeon who'd been considering the case, suddenly had 8 emergency interventions booked across the next 10 days, stacked so densely that even reviewing a new patient would mean delaying surgery for someone already prepped. The surgeries were legitimate. Megan checked. A ruptured aortic aneurysm, 2 trauma cases, 3 elective procedures that couldn't be moved. But the timing was perfect. Pierce had found real cases that needed real surgeons and arranged them through the chief of surgery in a way that made Hayes's reconstruction impossible to schedule without delaying the surgeries that would actually save lives. No administrator could argue that an experimental procedure should take priority over an active bleed or a time-sensitive trauma. The brilliance of it made Megan's jaw clench. This wasn't crude. This was the work of someone who understood hospital politics the way a sniper understands wind compensation. She was reviewing Hayes's chart at the nurse's station when her badge wouldn't scan at the ICU floor access point. The red light. The soft beep of rejection. Megan swiped again. Same response. Her badge permissions had been revoked. She could still access the main floors, the medication dispensary, the employee areas, just not the ICU. Not Hayes's floor. System error, asked Sarah, one of the remaining ICU nurses, watching from behind the desk. No, Megan said quietly. It's not an error. She didn't need to check with administration. She already knew. Pierce had called the chief of medicine that morning. Megan had seen him in the hallway, phone to his ear, saying words like scope of practice and unauthorized intervention and liability risk. By noon, the chief had apparently decided that Megan's access should be restricted pending a review of her credentials and her role with the SEAL patient. The message was clear: you're being isolated. By day 3, Pierce had escalated to the board members themselves. He called them individually. Megan learned this from the hushed conversation she overheard between the chief and the hospital administrator, describing her as a nurse who'd taken it upon herself to coordinate surgical consultations and provide medical guidance that exceeded her scope, a nurse who was becoming emotionally involved with a patient in ways that could compromise judgment, a nurse who represented a serious liability exposure if her unauthorized medical direction resulted in adverse outcomes. The word liability was the magic word. It made administrators move. By 1400 hours on day 3, Megan was called into the chief of medicine's office. The chief sat behind his desk, mahogany, heavy, the kind of furniture that announced authority without words. Pierce stood to the side, his posture relaxed, almost bored, the expression of someone who'd already won and was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. Captain O'Brien, the chief began, and Megan's breathing didn't change because she'd trained for this moment the way she'd trained for everything else. We've received multiple reports that you've been providing medical guidance outside your scope as a registered nurse. Dr. Pierce has documented these instances, and the board is concerned about liability and patient safety implications. I haven't provided medical guidance, Megan said. Her voice was steady, flat, the voice of someone who'd given hundreds of sit-reps to officers with more stars than God. I've offered to facilitate care coordination. You've recommended surgical consultations, Pierce said. His voice carried that particular tone of someone delivering bad news with regret. You've made clinical assessments about his condition. You've told him you would help him find treatment options the hospital isn't prepared to provide. That crosses from coordination into medical practice. The 5 doctors who refused him, Megan started. The 5 doctors who appropriately declined a procedure that's experimental and high risk, Pierce corrected smoothly. Each with documented clinical reasoning. Each protecting a patient who may not be in a stable enough condition for elective surgery. Megan didn't respond. She understood the trap now. Every move she'd made to help Hayes had been documented, reframed, transformed into evidence of overreach. And she couldn't argue without revealing exactly how much medical knowledge she possessed, which would only strengthen the case that she was practicing medicine without a license. We're suspending your access to the ICU effective immediately, the chief said. He didn't meet her eyes. Pending a formal review by the Hospital Credentials Committee. You'll be reassigned to the medical surgical floor for the next 2 weeks while we investigate these allegations. And if I decline the reassignment? Megan's voice remained flat. Pierce smiled slightly. Then we'll have to report the incident to the state nursing board. The chief shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Pierce, that's not necessary if Ms. O'Brien cooperates with the review process. But Megan understood what Pierce had just done. He'd transformed a hospital disciplinary action into a threat that could follow her for years. Even if she was cleared, the report would exist. The investigation would exist. Questions would exist. She stood. When does the reassignment begin? Tomorrow's shift, the chief said. You'll work med-surg with Stephanie's team. Megan nodded once. She didn't let the rage show on her face, didn't let the helplessness show either. She was trained for much harder things than this, standing in a hospital office while a competent man dismantled her ability to protect a patient. She'd stood in worse. She'd survived this. But as she turned to leave, Pierce spoke one more time. For what it's worth, I do respect your compassion. Hayes is fortunate to have someone who cares. He's just not fortunate enough for this hospital to risk its reputation on an experimental surgery that will probably fail anyway. Megan paused at the door. She could have said something devastating. She had options, comments about bedside manner, observations about his motives, questions about whether those 5 doctors had all independently decided Hayes wasn't worth saving or if one senior physician's opinion had simply shaped the rest. She could have made that room very uncomfortable with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having actually seen things that would make this man's hospital politics seem like playground negotiations. Instead, she said nothing. She opened the door. She left. The walk to the parking garage took 7 minutes. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel. Her breathing was controlled. But the moment she reached her car, a silver sedan parked in the far corner where she'd always insisted on being, where she could see the exits and the entrances and everything in between, she allowed herself one measured breath and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Hayes was alone now. The ICU staff was stretched too thin. The surgeons were booked. And she'd been removed from the board. Whatever happened in the next 48 hours would happen without her ability to intervene, which meant it would happen exactly the way Pierce had planned it. She thought of Rodriguez's flag, still folded in her locker downstairs. She thought of the mission brief that had landed her here. She thought of the encrypted phone in her pocket that could summon help, but help would blow the operation sky high, would expose her identity, would end a 7-month surveillance operation that was supposed to last 18 months. She thought of Hayes in that room, gasping, alone, with monitors no one was checking and doctors who'd already decided he wasn't worth saving. Her phone buzzed. A message from Torres, motion sensor on Hayes's room. Vitals just spiked. RR34. Something's wrong. Megan checked the time. 0237 hours. The night shift. The staffing gaps. The moment Pierce had engineered into existence. She had 22 minutes before the shift change. 22 minutes before day nurses arrived and the night crew briefed them on status. 22 minutes before Hayes's crisis became someone else's responsibility and they'd manage it the way they managed everything else, with protocols and standard care and the kind of competent medicine that kills blind Navy SEALs because no one's willing to fight for them. She started the car. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm as Megan finished the O200 vitals check on the 3rd floor. Hayes slept in room 312. His chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of someone whose body was still learning how to exist without sight. She'd been watching him for 3 hours through the cracked door, the way a combat medic watches a wounded operator, not hovering, but present. Ready. The ICU staffing gaps Pierce had carved into the schedule meant nobody else was coming. Tonight, Hayes was hers to monitor. At 0245, the breathing changed. Rapid. Shallow. The kind of breathing that meant the body was drowning from the inside. Megan moved without thinking, her hands already reaching for the pulse oximeter as she crossed the threshold. 94%. Dropping. 92. The monitor's rhythm was still steady, but his work of breathing had tripled, accessory muscles pulling at his ribs like he was fighting something invisible. His blind eyes moved beneath closed lids, chasing nightmares that had nothing to do with this moment. Hayes. Her voice cut through the dark like a surgical blade. Stay with me. His hand found hers. Gripping. The tremor wasn't fear, it was hypoxia, his brain beginning to starve for oxygen. 89%. His blood pressure climbed, 148/92 and rising. Tachycardia at 118. Every number screamed the same diagnosis, and Megan's hands moved on their own because pain was data and data meant action. Tension pneumothorax. A missed rib fracture from the original blast had shifted during his healing, and something, movement during physical therapy, a cough, the simple act of breathing, had punctured the visceral pleura. Air was flooding his chest cavity now, collapsing his right lung and pushing his heart sideways, compressing the left side. He was suffocating while his lungs filled with nothing. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fluorescent light above his bed hummed its mechanical song, indifferent and cold. Megan's training moved her forward while her mind catalogued the math. He had minutes before cardiac arrest, seconds before unconsciousness erased his ability to compensate. The code team was on the 4th floor. A call would bring them in 6 minutes. He wouldn't last 6 minutes. She reached for the crash cart. Her fingers found the needle tray with the certainty of muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought. 14-gauge angiocath. The long silver needle that looked like it could pierce titanium. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location, the emergency solution designed for moments that weren't supposed to happen in a monitored hospital bed on the night shift when the attending physician had made sure nobody was watching. I need you to hold still. 10 words maximum. Direct. The kind of command that bypassed fear and accessed something older, the part of the brain that recognized authority in a voice and obeyed it. 1 breath in. She swabbed the site with antiseptic. The smell of it filled her nostrils, sharp and chemical, grounding her in this single moment. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady when she was field dressing a gunshot wound in a convoy outside Fallujah with rounds snapping overhead. They'd been steady when she was holding a Marine's intestines in place while waiting for the helicopter. They were steady now. The needle went in. The resistance of skin, then the sudden give of muscle giving way to the hollow space beyond. The hiss of air escaping, that specific sound of pressure equalizing, of a lung re-expanding, of a human being choosing to keep living. She didn't pull back. She advanced the catheter, plastic sliding through the needle's lumen, and withdrew the needle itself with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before and once was enough to understand the math of it. Oxygen saturation climbing. 93. 95. 100. His breathing slowed. The shallow panicked rhythm transforming into something that resembled survival. His grip on her hand loosened slightly. Not relaxing. Shifting from panic to awareness. His lips moved. No sound came out. You just got a collapsed lung. Not going to die on my shift. Her voice was level. Clinical. The kind of tone that communicated absolute certainty, which was the only kind of tone worth using when someone's nervous system was coated in adrenaline. Code team's coming anyway. You're going to need imaging. You're going to be fine. The call button had been pressed the moment her needle went in. Habit. Protocol. Something she'd learned in a combat hospital in Baghdad where you never broke a rule unless breaking it meant saving someone, and then you broke it hard and owned it completely. The code team arrived at 0253, 40 seconds before Hayes would have begun losing consciousness, which was the exact amount of time Megan had calculated when she'd made the decision to intervene. Respiratory therapy. ICU attending. Nursing supervisor. The team assembled with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times, except they'd never done this because Hayes had been scheduled for discharge in the morning and nobody expected his missed fracture to shift in the dead hours of night when the hospital skeleton crew was stretched across 12 floors. They found Megan holding pressure on the catheter site, Hayes breathing easier, and an incident report that was already writing itself in invisible ink the moment her needle pierced his skin. Dr. Pierce arrived 20 minutes later. Called at home by a resident who'd understood immediately that this would interest him, understood it with the clarity of someone who'd watched the doctor wait for Megan to make exactly this kind of move. To overstep. To break protocol in a way that would create documentation, investigation, and leverage. Pierce surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. His eyes moved from Hayes to the catheter to Megan's face, where her composure held like reinforced concrete. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He'd gotten what he'd been working toward for 72 hours, a moment where she'd proven she was willing to violate hospital procedure, to practice medicine beyond her scope, to risk everything because her judgment told her it was right. He had the confession written in the medical record. By 0800 hours, Pierce had launched his final offensive. A formal complaint with the chief of medicine for practicing medicine without a license, cease it to both board members he'd already cultivated. The incident report was attached with sections highlighted in yellow like a roadmap to termination. Recommendation for immediate removal before legal liability escalated. He personally hand-delivered the security footage request to Torres in IT, the Marine veteran who'd been working the night shift, asking for all recordings of Megan's interactions with Hayes to be compiled. Torres stared at the request for exactly 3 seconds, then filed it in the way that hospitals filed things when they were doing their job. The footage existed. The request was documented. Everything would be discoverable if anyone sued. But Torres wouldn't move fast. Torres understood what he was looking at. At 1100 hours, Megan was called to the chief of medicine's office on the administrative floor. Pierce sat in the corner with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who'd finally backed his opponent into a corner they couldn't escape. The chief of medicine was competent but not brave, a distinction Megan had understood within her first week at Cedar Creek. Competent people followed policy. Brave people changed it. Your actions, however well-intentioned, violated hospital protocol, the chief said, not meeting her eyes. You performed a procedure beyond your scope of practice. That creates significant legal exposure for this institution. I saved his life, Megan said. Quiet. Factual. The kind of statement that lived beyond defensiveness. You may have. But the manner in which you did it, without physician authorization, without proper documentation, puts this hospital at risk. The chief slid a termination letter across the desk. Effective immediately, your employment here is terminated. Security will escort you from the building. Megan took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from understanding that her cover had just shattered like tempered glass, that the incident report would trigger automated Pentagon review of any military-connected patient case, that her handler would be pulling her file within hours. That everything she'd built in the last 8 months was collapsing around her, and the only thing keeping her upright was the weight of obligation to someone else. She didn't fight. Fighting would create more documentation, more investigation, more attention. She'd learned that lesson in 3 different countries. When you were burned, you burned clean and fast, and you didn't add accelerant by arguing about it. I understand, she said. She collected her locker contents in silence. Her civilian clothes in a canvas bag. A protein bar she'd been saving for the night shift when the vending machines were out of everything except the flavors nobody wanted. Rodriguez's folded flag, the fabric worn soft from a decade of her hands touching it in the dark hours when nobody else could see. That one piece of her real life that she'd allowed herself to keep. She drove home with the windows down despite the October cold, the air moving across her face like a version of forgetting. The drive took 37 minutes. She didn't play music. She didn't call anyone. She arrived at the small rental house on Oakmorn Street at 1347 hours and sat at the kitchen table with her scrubs still on, blue fabric holding the smell of antiseptic and that electric charge that came from being useful, from mattering to someone. At 1400 hours exactly, her 14-year-old son came home from school. He dropped his backpack by the door with the careless momentum of childhood and found her at the kitchen table, still in uniform, still in her scrubs, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. He was a smart kid. Observant. He'd learned that gift from her, or maybe she'd passed it down the way mothers passed down the weight of being someone who pays attention to things others miss. He looked at his mother and understood 3 truths simultaneously. She'd been home for hours, something catastrophic had occurred, and she couldn't explain it. Mom. His voice was smaller than usual. Younger. The voice of a child trying to reach an adult who'd temporarily become unreachable. "Are you okay?" Megan looked at her son and felt the entire structure of her operational life, the Navy commission she'd buried for 8 months, the undercover mission that had just blown apart, the careful lies she'd constructed to keep him ignorant and therefore safe, crumble into irrelevance. She couldn't explain why she was home at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. She couldn't explain the incident report or the termination or the truth about who she really was. She couldn't explain that she'd saved a man's life using skills the hospital didn't know she had, and lost everything in the process. "Yeah, sweetheart," she said finally. "Yeah, I'm okay." But even he could see that wasn't the truth. The next morning, everything changed again. The shadow box came through the Cedar Creek Medical lobby doors first, carried high like a torch. A 14-year-old boy with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw pushed past the front desk with the kind of quiet confidence that made security hesitate. The receptionist reached for the phone. The boy didn't stop. "Mom," he said, his voice cutting across the waiting room. "They need to see these." The lobby froze. The sound of his sneakers on tile echoed against the vaulted ceiling, the same acoustic space that had swallowed Megan's voice for 8 months, amplifying whispers, erasing pleas. Now a single teenager's declaration made it tremble. Hay sat in his wheelchair by the nurse's station, his head turned toward the commotion like a satellite dish finding signal. His sightless eyes aimed at the shadow box, at the uniform of a boy who'd inherited something most people never understood. When he whispered, his voice was barely audible, but clear, "Reaper 6. That name. That call sign. It hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 years, not since Baghdad, not since the rotor wash of the Black Hawk carrying her away from the airfield while Hayes stayed behind. The boy didn't respond. He didn't know what Reaper 6 meant. He only knew his mother did. A Marine colonel, visiting another patient, a routine courtesy call to a subordinate's brother, heard the name and turned. He saw the shadow box, stepped forward, and opened it carefully. The morning light from the lobby windows caught the medals in a way that made them seem to generate their own illumination. His jaw moved as he read, and his voice grew louder with each line, addressing not the boy but the entire lobby, every waiting patient, every nurse, every person who had whispered about the temp nurse who'd overstepped. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said. The room contracted. "Purple Heart." A pause, deliberate as a heartbeat. "Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal." The 2-star general emerging from the administrative elevator stopped mid-step. His hand rose without thinking, a salute to the decorations, to the weight of sacrifice made visible. His uniform held more stars than most people saw in a lifetime, and it moved first, before his mind caught up, an old recognition of rank that transcended title, of the kind of service that lived in hardware and memory. Dr. Pierce stepped forward, his face pale as surgical gauze. "This is completely irregular. I'm calling hospital security right now. This patient needs." "Captain O'Brien is part of a classified operational program," a voice cut through, sharp as a scalpel. 2 Pentagon officials in dark suits stood in the main entrance, having arrived during the commotion. The one speaking didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And this facility is now under federal review." The lobby exhaled. The sound was almost audible, the collective release of breath from people who'd been holding tension in their chests without knowing it. The receptionist's hand fell from the phone. The security guard stepped back to his desk. Hazy's face turned toward the voices with something that might have been relief, or recognition, or both. What Pierce didn't understand was what had already begun 17 floors below the lobby. In the hospital's IT operations center, Marine veteran Torres had been monitoring security protocols when he'd noticed the Pentagon officials entering. He'd overheard fragments, whispers, Captain O'Brien, classified program, and the neural pathways of 3 combat tours fired all at once. He'd been watching Dr. Pierce's terminal before the officials even reached the administrator's office. At 1045 hours, when Pierce had logged in with his administrative override and started deleting footage, Torres hadn't stopped him. Instead, his backup system, sophisticated, invisible, running parallel to the hospital's official servers like a ghost in the machine, had captured every deletion request before it executed. He'd archived the moment Pierce deleted the Grand Rounds recording, the vending machine incident, the threat in Hayes's room, the conversation with the chief of medicine about a nurse who'd saved a patient's life and paid for it with her career. By noon, Torres walked into the administrator's office carrying a USB drive. His boots made no sound on the carpeting. He set the drive on the desk without speaking and waited while the Pentagon officials opened the files. The footage played silently on 3 monitors, a cinematic indictment, Pierce's contemptuous smile as residents mimicked Megan's voice, his hand gripping her shoulder as he threatened her career, his eyes as he signed the termination paperwork that would trigger federal oversight of an operation requiring absolute invisibility. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the emails. 6 months of correspondence between Pierce and a medical equipment supplier, archived on company servers that had already been subpoenaed by the FBI. Inflated orders. Consulting fees paid to a shell corporation that Pierce's brother-in-law managed. Fabricated usage reports doctored in Pierce's handwriting, each one a felony. He was afraid she'd discover the financial irregularities, one of the Pentagon officials said, reading through supply chain documentation. Her charting was too meticulous. She was already flagging cost discrepancies in Hayes's file. So he eliminated her. Pierce hadn't been protecting his reputation. He'd been protecting his income. The irony was that he'd done exactly what he'd accused Megan of doing, practicing medicine without a license, in his case the license to commit fraud without consequence. By 1400 hours, FBI agents arrived in the lobby where Megan's son still stood holding the shadow box. Pierce was escorted from the building past the nurse's station where Hayes sat, past the elevator where the general had saluted, past the receptionist who'd watched a teenage boy accomplish what 8 months of undercover presence had failed to do. The lobby watched him walk, his face the color of old bone, his hands shaking like he was navigating darkness without instruments. His medical license was suspended by 1600 hours. His country club memberships quietly revoked by close of business. His wife filed for separation on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later, taking the house, the car, the constructed life that had been built on kickbacks and fear. The hospital board would later issue a statement, "We deeply regret any institutional failures that prevented appropriate oversight of clinical decision-making. Dr. Pierce's employment has been terminated pending investigation." 6 months passed. Cedar Creek Medical settled a lawsuit with Megan for an amount that was never disclosed but which local veteran networks would speculate about for years. Her personnel file was expunged of the termination. But she didn't come back as a nurse. Her Pentagon handler reassigned her to a different facility, different cover, same mission, monitoring wounded operators, holding classified assignments that required her presence to remain invisible. The Navy SEAL community was small enough that her story spread anyway, passed in encrypted messages and late-night conversations on secure lines. Captain O'Brien. Reaper 6. The nurse who'd performed a needle decompression with a 14-gauge catheter in the second intercostal space and saved a SEAL's life, then sacrificed her cover to do it again. On a cold November morning, 6 months after the FBI walked out of Cedar Creek Medical's lobby, Megan's phone rang. The number wasn't classified. It was just Hayes, asking if she could meet him at Cedar Creek's chapel. She drove back to Raleigh in a civilian car, windshield rain hammering like gunfire, her hand steady on the wheel the way they were always steady, the way they'd been trained to be steady under pressure that would have broken most people into pieces. The chapel was small, non-denominational, designed for quiet grief and uncertain hope. Hayes stood by the altar in a shaft of light from the stained glass. He was standing. His eyes, partially restored by the experimental surgery Megan had secretly arranged through Pentagon channels, the surgery that 5 doctors had refused until a captain had arranged its funding through channels they would never know existed, tracked her movement across the stone floor. He could see her now. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to perceive shape and light, and the woman who'd been nothing but a voice in darkness, suddenly made visible. Megan carried Rodriguez's flag in her hands. The folded triangle was heavy with more than fabric, weighted with mission and sacrifice and the particular gravity of things made sacred by loss. She placed it in Hayes's partially restored hands, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about such things. "This belonged to Rodriguez," she said. "The teammate I would have served with in your place. He didn't come home from Baghdad. The flag was in my locker for 3 years. But he always said the flag belongs to the men who come after, not the ones who fall. You came after, Jackson. It's yours now." Hayes held the flag like it was constructed of something fragile enough to shatter with careless handling. His vision focused on the gold nameplate, the precise folds, the weight of continuation. Outside the chapel, Megan's son waited in the car with headphones on, doing calculus homework like this was routine, like this was how normal people spent their mornings. Torres had been promoted to director of hospital security, implementing protocols that would eventually be adopted by the VA system in 3 states. The 5 doctors who'd refused Hayes remained at Cedar Creek, their careers untouched but their reputations quietly noted in veteran networks, whispered about in cafeterias and surgical lounges, understood by the specific community that remembered everything. In a small office in the Pentagon, an analyst updated Megan's file with a single handwritten note in the margin. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've made it this far, you know something most people don't. Subscribe to uncover more stories of the people who serve in silence. Like this video if you believe quiet strength is the most dangerous kind. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were legendary all along?